The signal came at 03:14 on a Tuesday, which was the kind of hour when the universe felt entitled to do whatever it wanted. Mara Losh heard it first, not because she was special, not because she had been chosen, but because she was the only one awake in the Copernicus deep signal array at that particular moment. Sitting in a folding chair with cold coffee and a spreadsheet she had been pretending to work on for 2 hours. The rest of her team was asleep in the HAB module 60 meters down the hill, and the Mongolian steppe outside the reinforced windows was doing what it always did at that hour, which was nothing at all. The signal was 3 tones. That was it. 3 tones in a sequence repeating, perfectly spaced. She wrote them down on the back of a fuel expenditure report she had been ignoring for a week. Anta, Odeli, Uta. That was how she transcribed the sound. Not because it was language, not yet, but because that was what the tones sounded like when she hummed them to herself. And she had always thought in sound before she thought in data. Her mother had been a musician. It was perhaps the only useful thing she had inherited. She flagged the signal, filed a report, and told no one else for 6 hours because she wanted to be certain she was not having a breakdown. By morning she was certain that she was not, and by afternoon the report had made it to the UEA Signal Processing Center in Budapest. And by the following week, every radio telescope on Earth with a decent dish had confirmed it. The signal was real, it was repeating, it was not natural. The scientific community spent 14 months arguing about what it was. Mara spent those 14 months building a response. She was not, strictly speaking, authorized to do this. She was a mid-level signal analyst, not a communications theorist, not a xenolinguist, not a mission planner. She had a PhD in astrophysics that she had finished 3 years late because she had taken a detour through applied mathematics and then through electrical engineering, picking up tools the way some people pick up languages. Not out of discipline, but out of insatiable, compulsive need to understand how things worked. She had been told, more than once, that this made her unfocused. She preferred the word ready. The response she built was not clever. She did not attempt mathematics, which everyone else was trying. She did not try prima numbers or geometric ratios or any of the other things that humans had imagined would bridge the gap between species. She sent back the signal itself, mirrored, folded, 3 tones becoming 6. The original sequence and its own reflection, a simple acknowledgement that said, "We heard you, we have ears, we are here." It took 11 days for the reply to arrive. It was not 3 tones anymore, it was 10,000. She did not sleep for the next 48 hours. And when she finally sat back from her workstation and pressed her palms against her eyes, she knew. With the particular quiet certainty that only comes at the intersection of exhaustion and discovery, that she had been speaking to someone. The UEA Security Council was briefed in the 3rd month of what was now officially classified as First Contact Protocol. Mara was present at the briefing, not because she was invited, but because she had driven 4 hours from the array to Budapest without telling anyone, walked into the building using her standard access credentials, and simply sat down at the conference table before anyone thought to ask whether she was supposed to be there. This approach, she had found, worked more often than one might expect. The being on the other end of the signal was called, in its own language, something that the UEA's translation AI rendered as the overseer. The species called themselves the Vor. They had been watching Earth for a long time. Specifically, they had been watching humans for a long time, through instruments that made the Copernicus array look like a child's toy. They had been watching, and they had been deciding. Deciding what? Asked General Halvorson, who ran UEA military affairs, and who had the specific quality of face that suggested he had already decided how every meeting was going to end. Mara read from the translation, "Whether we were ready to be managed." The room was quiet. "Managed," Halvorson repeated. "That's the translation. It might mean something slightly different in the original. The AI flags it's a close match but not perfect." She paused. "The closest other option is farmed." She watched it land. She watched them process it. She watched the particular human process of going from incomprehension through denial to a cold, clear, functional anger, and she thought, there it is. There's the thing that's going to save us. Not cleverness, not readiness, that. The Vor arrived 8 months later. The ships did not crash land, and they did not hover dramatically over major cities. They materialized. That was the only word that worked, because the process was not descent, but something more like resolution, the way a thought becomes certain. In a ring around the equator, 112 vessels each the size of a city block, hanging at an altitude of 40 kilometers. and doing absolutely nothing threatening because they did not need to. The Vor were individually beautiful. Mara saw one for the first time through a camera relay from the UN diplomatic chamber where the first formal exchange was happening without her because she had not been invited. And this time there were actual guards. They were tall, 3 meters, maybe more. Their bodies were structured like the memory of a human body seen from a great distance. Bilateral symmetry, upright posture, limbs in roughly the right positions. But the details were wrong in ways that bypassed the aesthetic and went straight for the uncanny. Their skin was layered, translucent near the joints, shifting through colors when they moved, that had no names in any human language she knew. Their faces had eyes that faced almost entirely forward, irises the color of old ice, and the expression they wore in the chamber was one she eventually identified as something close to patience. The patience of someone waiting for a child to finish a tantrum. The Vor opened with a declaration that had clearly been prepared well in advance. Mara received the translated transcript an hour after the session from a junior analyst who owed her 3 favors. She read it twice, folded it, and put it in her coat pocket. The declaration said that the Vor had been stewards of this region of the galaxy for 11,000 years, that they had observed 43 species reach the stage of interstellar signal transmission. That of those 31 had been integrated into the Vor governance structure, which the translation AI rendered as the management. That integration was not optional. That the terms of integration would be communicated through the proper diplomatic channels. That humanity should not be alarmed. Mara went home, made tea, and sat at her kitchen table for a long time. She thought about the word managed. She thought about her mother, who had played violin in a provincial orchestra her whole life, and who had, near the end, told Mara that the hardest thing she had ever learned was the difference between following the conductor and listening to the music. You could do both, she said, but they were not the same thing, and when you confused them, you stopped being a musician and became something else. She had never named what that something else was. She had not needed to. Mara picked up her phone and called a man named Dex Gusev. Gusev was not a scientist. He was technically a civil engineer who worked for the UEA Infrastructure Division and whose specific expertise was in the structural integrity of things that were not supposed to move under pressure. He was also less technically the person who had been her closest friend for 11 years, who had once talked her down from a roof in Prague, and who had the specific gift of understanding a situation completely from a one-sentence summary and then asking exactly the right question. She told him in one sentence. He was quiet for 3 seconds. So they're expecting compliance, he said. Yes, and they're not expecting negotiation. No, have you told anyone else? I'm telling you first. Another pause. She heard him set something down, a cup maybe. When do we need to move? This was why she called him first. What came next took 6 weeks and required the specific cooperation of 11 people, a lot of unsupervised access to equipment that had already been repurposed for first contact operations, and a series of decisions that would later be described in the official UEA inquiry as unauthorized, reckless, and ultimately inexplicable. The inquiry was not wrong on any of those counts. It was simply missing context. The context was this: Mara had kept talking to the Vor. She had never stopped. The official channel was handled by the diplomatic corps, which was slow and formal and concerned primarily with optics. Mara's channel was none of those things. She had been running her own signal thread from the array for 5 months, using a modified version of her original reflected signal protocol, speaking not to the Vor diplomatic apparatus but to something she had begun to think of as the edge of the organization. The Vor who monitored the signal arrays, who maintained the observation instruments, who were, in the immense bureaucratic architecture of an 11,000-year-old governance structure, the equivalent of junior analysts who worked late and answered messages that weren't meant for them. She had been talking to one in particular for 3 months before she understood what it was. The Vor called itself, or herself. The translation was genuinely unclear on the question of gender in a way that suggested the concept might not map Ayala. It monitored a sector of the signal band that included Earth's transmissions, had been doing so for 60 years, had watched Mara's original reflected signal with something the translation AI flagged as close to delight, and had responded not through official channels, but through a private thread that bore the Vor equivalent of a personal frequency signature. Ayala had watched humans for 60 years. She had watched them build and argue and grieve and persist. She had watched them from the distance that the Vor considered appropriate for unintegrated species, through instruments of extraordinary precision, and she had, the word the AI settled on, after 3 attempts was ached. She had ached over them. The way you ache over something you cannot touch. Mara understood this. She understood it in the way you understand something that has no rational content and does not require any. She told Ayala what the management intended for Earth. Ayala already knew. She had known for 80 years, from the moment Earth's electromagnetic signature crossed the threshold that triggered the integration assessment. She had filed 17 internal objections through the appropriate VOR channels over 6 decades. All 17 had been reviewed and dismissed with the same language. The management determines readiness. Readiness is not the concern of signal monitors. The thing Ayala told Mara, the thing that changed everything, the thing that Mara folded into her understanding of the situation and carried forward into every decision that followed, was this. The Vor had never encountered a species that talked back, not in the way Mara had. Not the mathematical proofs, not the geometric sequences, not the careful formal attempts at xenodiplomacy. What she meant was the reflected signal, the mirror, the answer that said, not here is our mathematics, prove we are intelligent, but simply, we heard you. We are here. Every other species the Vor had contacted had responded with proof of worthiness, with demonstrations, with the equivalent of a job interview for the position of being allowed to continue existing. Mara had said hello. It had apparently broken something loose in the Vor understanding of humans that 60 years of observation had not managed to shift. You cannot observe your way to understanding a species that greets instead of proves. You cannot manage your way through a hello. She explained this to Gusev, who was sitting across from her in the array's small break room with a cup of coffee and an expression of concentrated attention. So what you're saying, he said slowly, is that the one thing they don't know how to categorize us as is people. Something like that, and if we can make them see us as people, then integration becomes a different conversation. He was quiet for a moment. That's not a plan. No, she agreed, it's a premise. The plan is what we do with it. What they did with it was audacious and stupid, and Mara would later admit, heavily dependent on things going wrong in exactly the right ways. Gusev called in favors from 12 years of infrastructure work across 4 continents and arranged for access to the UEA's Deep Signal Broadcast Array in northern Canada, the one with a transmission range that could punch through the interference the Vor ships were generating. 3 of Mara's former students provided modified encoding protocols. A retired military communications officer named Chen, who had been furious about the management since the day of the first briefing, and who had a specific and implacable quality of anger that reminded Mara of her own, provided the technical clearance. And Mara spent 2 weeks writing. Not a diplomatic communique, not a proof of intelligence, not a statement of rights or a declaration of sovereignty, or any of the formal things that the UEA's diplomatic corps was producing in enormous quantities. She wrote stories, human stories. She wrote about the wall in Berlin and who had taken it apart and with what. She wrote about the child in the photograph, the one running from the napalm, and the photographer who took the picture and then put the camera down. She wrote about the Apollo 1 crew and the technician who had tried to open the hatch. She wrote about the man who stood in front of the tank, and the fact that no one had ever agreed on who he was. She wrote about the refugee camps and the volunteers who ran them, and the specific, irrational, inexhaustible human habit of showing up for people you had never met in places you had never planned to be. She wrote about music and the fact that every isolated culture in human history had independently invented it. She wrote about language and the fact that every human language had a word for home. She wrote about her mother. She kept writing until she had something that was not a proof, and not a demonstration, and not an argument for humanity's worthiness. She had something that was simply an account of what humanity was, what it had done, what it had chosen, what it had refused to stop doing even when the circumstances were catastrophically against it. And she transmitted it through the array at 03:14 on a Tuesday, because she was sentimental enough to note the symmetry. Then she went back to the array and waited. The Vor response came in 19 hours. It was not through the diplomatic channel. It was not through Ayala's private frequency. It came through every signal receiver on Earth simultaneously, at a strength that was technically impossible, given the transmission protocols the Vor had been using, which meant they had stopped bothering to constrain themselves, and were simply speaking at full volume, because they wanted to be heard. The translation AI took 4 minutes to render it. Mara read it in 6 seconds. It said, "We did not know what you were, that was all." 4 words in translation, possibly more in the original, possibly fewer. The AI flagged it as high confidence, but noted that the vor concept being expressed might not have a clean human equivalent. But 4 words was what she had, and she sat with them for a long time in the break room, while Gusev refilled his coffee and did not say anything because he understood when not to. She thought about the vor workers she had read about in Ayala's transmissions, the ones who maintained the observation arrays, who spent their careers watching and cataloging and filing reports that were reviewed and dismissed. She thought about the specific loneliness of watching something for 60 years, and being told your response to it was not relevant. She thought about Ayala filing 17 objections over 6 decades, each one dismissed with the same language. She thought about what it meant to see something clearly and be unable to act on what you saw. She understood that too. She understood it in a way that had nothing to do with aliens and everything to do with being the kind of person who drove 4 hours to a meeting she hadn't been invited to because she could not sit still in the face of something that needed doing. The diplomatic sessions that followed were different. Not immediately. The vor negotiating apparatus was 11,000 years old and had a great deal of institutional momentum, and institutional momentum was, in Mara's experience, harder to shift than any physical object. But Ayala was now present in the sessions, not as a signal monitor, but as something the vor diplomatic hierarchy classified as an observer of special interest, which was apparently an internal designation that had never been used before, but which the management found difficult to countermand, because it existed in the charter from the first 1,000 years of the vor governance structure, and had simply never been invoked. Ayala had invoked it. Mara attended the sessions too, as a consultant, which was a title General Halverson had assigned her, with an expression suggesting he found the whole situation personally offensive but could not identify a specific regulation she was currently violating. The vor across the table were different in these sessions. Not warmer. Warmth was perhaps not in their expressive vocabulary in any form Mara could read, but there was something that had shifted in the quality of their attention. They were no longer patient in the way a parent is patient with a child. They were patient in a different way. The way you are patient with something you are trying to understand. She recognized it because it was the way she listened to new signals. What humanity negotiated over the following 8 months was not independence. That word did not appear in any document on either side, because its meaning was genuinely contested, whether it meant freedom from management or simply freedom from management without consent. What was negotiated, instead, was the thing that the vor had apparently never had occasion to develop a framework for: partnership. The word in the vor language that the AI eventually settled on, after 6 weeks of back and forth with the diplomatic linguistics team, was something that translated most cleanly as alongside. Not under, not managed, not integrated. Alongside, it was a small word, it was an enormous one. On the day the framework document was signed, a process that involved representatives from 14 human governments and 4 vor administrative branches, and which took 11 hours because every single clause required 3 separate translation passes. Mara sat outside the building on the steps and ate a sandwich she had bought from a cart down the street, because she had skipped breakfast and she was, after everything, extremely hungry. Gusev came and sat next to her. "Is that turkey?" he said. "It's supposed to be. I think it might be something else." I didn't ask. He took half without being invited, which was characteristic. They sat for a while in the afternoon light, which was thin and autumn pale and absolutely ordinary in the way that only certain moments are, the kind of ordinary that you notice because something large has just happened and the world has not changed its texture to match. "Do you think it'll hold?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. She thought about signals. Not what she wanted to hear, but what was actually there. "I think it has the same chance as everything else humans have tried to build that was worth building. So medium, so stubborn," she said. He snorted. She finished her sandwich. A pigeon landed near her feet and looked at her with the specific assessment of a creature that had made peace with asking for things. She pulled a piece of bread from the edge of the wrapper and put it on the ground. Above them, invisible from the ground, the vor ships held their positions at 40 kilometers. They would hold them for another 2 years while the framework was implemented. During that time, there would be 3 crises, 2 near collapses of the process, and 1 incident involving a vor administrative vessel and a human cargo drone over the Pacific that would require personal intervention from Ayla and from Mara, and which would later become, in the official history of First Contact, a footnote. In Mara's personal account, which she wrote by hand in a series of notebooks and never published, it was 3 pages. Not because the incident itself was large, but because of what had happened in the middle of it, in a communication session that ran for 4 hours across a signal gap. When Ayla had asked her a question, Ayla had asked, "Why did you reflect the signal back?" And Mara had thought about it for a long time. Not stalling, but genuinely thinking, the way she thought about problems that didn't have a single clean answer. And then she had said, "Because it seemed rude not to." There was a pause. In the transmission, pauses were data. She had learned to read them. This one was not confusion. It was not processing delay. It was, she thought, something like laughter. She was not certain the Vor concept of laughter was the same as the human one. She was fairly certain it didn't need to be. The framework held for a generation. In the official sense, the political sense, the diplomatic sense, it was a document, a set of agreements, a structure of mutual non-interference and cooperative signal sharing, and the specific, laborious work of learning to understand each other without assuming the other side's understanding as a baseline. In the human sense, the sense Mara cared about, it was something smaller and more durable. It was Ayla's frequency appearing in her signal feed at odd hours. Not with official communications, but with observations. A storm system over the Bay of Bengal that Vor orbital instruments had tracked for 6 days. A mathematical pattern in the migration routes of humpback whales that Ayla had noticed and found inexplicable. A question once about music. Specifically about why humans made music in moments of grief, which the observation data consistently showed but which fell outside every predictive model the Vor had for grief response behavior. Mara had thought about that one for 2 days before answering. "Because we need to put it somewhere," she had finally said. "It has to go somewhere outside yourself, or it just stays in you and gets heavier. Music is somewhere." Ella had been quiet for a long time then. "We do not have this." Mara had not known what to say to that. So she had done what she always did when she didn't know what to say. She had sent something. A recording. Old. Analog. From the mid-20th century. Her mother's favorite. A violin concerto in D minor that Mara had carried on every hard drive she had owned since she was 19, and that she had listened to in the break room of the array on the night everything started. While the cold coffee went colder and the step was dark, and the signal was still just 3 tones that she was humming to herself because they had to go somewhere. She did not know if Ayla could hear it the way she heard it. She did not know if the encoding survived the transmission intact, or if the alien instruments that received it could parse the frequency ranges the human ear used, or if any of it meant anything on the other side. What she knew was that she had sent it. She had sent it because it was true, and because it was human, and because she had never been able to look at something that needed doing, and find a good enough reason to sit still. The concerto lasted 32 minutes. She knew because she had timed it once, in a way that was completely unlike her usual precision, not to analyze it, but simply to know how long she had. How long she was allowed. When the transmission confirmed receipt, she sat back in her chair and pressed her palms against her eyes, the way she had on the night the signal first came, and she stayed like that for a while, in the particular quiet that comes after something large, listening to whatever was on the other side of the dark. It took 11 days for the next response to arrive. This one was not an official communication. It was not a translation AI transcript. It was a raw signal, encoded in a format the Vor had used for intership communications in their early period of expansion, which Mara recognized because she had spent 3 weeks that winter going through Vor historical signal archives that Ayla had shared with the linguistics team. She decoded it herself, by hand, the way she decoded everything she wanted to understand, before she trusted a machine to tell her what it meant. It was 3 tones, not Anta Odeli Uda different tone. A different sequence, simple and clear, repeating in the same steady pulse as the original signal, but not the same frequency, not the same pattern. Something new, something that was as best she could tell. And she was careful here, she was always careful with first readings, something that meant, roughly, simply, approximately, "We hear you. We are here." She sat with that for a long time. Then she pulled out the fuel expenditure report she still hadn't filed. A different one, from a different year. But she had developed a habit of keeping one on hand, because she never knew when she was going to need something to write on, and she wrote the tones down. the way they sounded when she hummed them. Outside, the step was doing what it always did at that hour, which was nothing at all, and which was right now exactly enough. When the second formal review of the framework convened, 2 years after the signing, Mara was invited. Officially, with her name on the documentation and a chair assigned and everything. She sat in it, and felt slightly strange. The way you feel slightly strange in a room that has finally arranged itself around the shape of something you have been doing, without permission for a long time. General Halverson sat across the table and looked at her with an expression she had learned to read by then. Not the animosity of the early days, but something more complicated. The expression of a person who had been certain of something, and had lived long enough to find out they were right about the certainty and wrong about the object. He had been right that the situation required someone who would not stay in their lane. He had been wrong about which lane she was in. The framework review produced 3 amendments that year, 2 of which Mara had drafted, and 1 of which Ayala had proposed through the new joint communication channel. That was, as far as either side could tell, unprecedented in the 11,000-year history of the VOR management. The VOR amendment was this: that the signal archives of every integrated species, all 31 civilizations that the management had absorbed over 11 millennia, should be made accessible to all parties, including Earth. Mara read the proposal 3 times. 31 civilizations, 31 species who had reached the threshold and been integrated, and whose transmissions had been catalogued and stored in VOR archives for thousands of years. 31 sets of signals, in 31 languages, encoding 31 ways of being something in the universe. She thought about what it would mean to listen to them, to hear what they had tried to say at the moment of contact, what they had offered, what they had been proud of, what they had thought would matter. She thought about what it meant that Ayala had proposed this. She approved it immediately, without consultation, which was technically outside the bounds of her role as consultant, but which no one challenged, because by this point everyone understood that the question of what was technically outside Mara's bounds was not a productive line of inquiry. The archive access was established 3 months later. Mara was the first human to listen to it. She sat in the signal room of the Copernicus array, in the same folding chair, with coffee that was hot this time because Gusev had made it, and he was constitutionally incapable of giving someone cold coffee. And she listened. The first signal she chose was the oldest, 11,000 years ago. The species the VOR called the Antari, which was not their name for themselves. Their name for themselves had not survived the translation, had not survived at all, had been lost somewhere in 11 millennia of archival management, in the way that things are lost when the people doing the managing do not understand the importance of what they are keeping. What had survived was the signal, 3 tones, different from hers, different from Ayala's return, but 3 tones in a sequence repeating, perfectly spaced. She sat with that for a very long time. Then she picked up her pen and wrote them down on the back of the fuel expenditure report, next to the VOR tones and the original Anta Odeli Uta. And she looked at what she had. 3 signals, 3 different moments of first contact across 11,000 years. 3 different species reaching across the dark and doing what apparently every species did when they found they were not alone. They said something simple. They said hello, or its equivalent, in whatever way their biology, and their history, and their specific way of being alive had given them to say it. Not proof, not demonstration, not a case for worthiness. Just I am here, are you? She thought about all 31. She thought about what it meant that 31 species had crossed this threshold and been integrated before they had a chance to understand what they were being integrated into. She thought about what it meant that it had taken a reflected signal from a mid-level analyst at Eero 314 on a Tuesday to make an 11,000-year-old civilization pause long enough to ask what it was actually looking at. She thought about her mother, who had played in a provincial orchestra her whole life, and who had told her the difference between following the conductor and listening to the music. She turned back to the archive. There were 31 signals. She was going to listen to every single one. It was going to take a long time. She had long since accepted, not a person who stopped once she had started, and she had started 11 years ago in this room, in this chair, with 3 tones she did not yet have words for, and a cold cup of coffee, and the specific human inability to hear something and not respond. Outside, dawn was breaking over the steppe in the way it did, slowly, without drama, the dark thinning at the edge, to something that was not quite color yet, but was the promise of it. She put on her headphones, she pressed play, she listened.